Peace, everybody. Just want to welcome everybody. Moors in America is for all Moorish Americans. And first and foremost, I want to give honors, much praise to the Most High, Father God Allah. Honors to Noble Drew Ali, our divine prophet, for bringing us our divine creed and nationality so that we may love instead of hate. And honors to the forerunner, Marcus Mosiah Garvey, for preparing the way for our prophet. And honors to all the faithful Moors out there all over the world. That's what we're doing it for. That's what Moors in America is all about.
Hello, Peter. How you doing?
I'm good. Thank you.
Okay,
I'm
great. Yeah, it's good to have you on. We can get started whenever you're ready.
I'm ready.
All right. Okay, thanks everybody for tuning in. Today with us we have a guest, Peter Moon, who's the author of various books. I actually have the Montauk Book of the Dead. I've read that, and I haven't read Montauk Revisited yet, but I have that, as well as Pyramids of Montauk. Very interesting. His books cover everything from the metaphysical, the occult, all types of historical information. He's got a lot of information about Scientology as well. I wanted to speak to you in particular about Pyramids of Montauk, and if I could ask you just right off, where were you physically and mentally when you wrote Pyramids of Montauk?
Well, I lived on Long Island, okay? At the time I wrote that, I was residing in Westbury, Long Island, which is about a half an hour to 45 minutes outside of New York City on Long Island. And if you go another couple hours out, or you reach Montauk, which is the extreme end of Long Island.
Okay.
It's about 3 hours from New York City to Montauk if you drive out there with all the traffic. It's about 120 miles.
Okay. And I'd say, you just from reading this, I say you're pretty advanced as far as metaphysics and the occult. Where were you at, mentally, when you created this? Would you call this biography?
The Pyramids of Montauk you're mentioning now. Okay, the Pyramids of Montauk is what you mentioned.
Yes.
I don't know
if
that's the book you're referring to, or you mean the Montauk Book of the Dead.
Yeah, I'm sorry for the confusion. When you wrote the Montauk Book of the Dead, where were you at mentally?
Okay. Well, that's a completely different question. Yeah, I'm still on Long Island. I've resided on Long Island since 1983, and originally from California, by way of Florida. But the Montauk Book of the Dead, I must explain. Okay, the Pyramids of Montauk is the third book in the Montauk series. Montauk Revisited being the second one, Montauk Project being the first. The Montauk Book of the Dead is published in 2005. 2005, and the whole story behind that book is tied to the Pyramids of Montauk. And it's a rather involved story because I discovered there were pyramids at Montauk. I have a photograph of them. I discovered a photograph, and it's the royal tribe of the Montauk Pharaoh, were the pharaohs. They're called the Pharaoh family, which has been translated into Fowler. So you'll find a lot of Fowlers because the Dutch would pronounce it Fowler, and it transmutated into Pharaoh, transliterated into Fowler. So you meet a lot of people that are Fowlers that should be or could be Pharaohs, and there's not a great deal of difference between the two names. However, the Montauk Book of the Dead was written. It is primarily, although not exclusively, about my experiences with L. Ron Hubbard and in Scientology. And the reason I wrote it was because it was supposed to. Oh man, I was writing a book about synchronicities with the Mount of Olives, and they were a result of my research into the Pyramids of Montauk. I was handed a playbill from the Ziegfeld Follies of 1910, and it was from the New Montauk Theater, which was on Livingston Street in Brooklyn. It said Montauk Theater. Somebody saw this in an antique shop. It was a playbill. They gave it to me. After a year, I found out that there was buried within it, between the cardboard and the playbill, were 2 pictures of Jesus on Mount Olive. And I said, what the hell is this? And I started looking up olives and the Mount of Olives. And then it turned out that Olive Farrow, who was the matriarch of the Montauk Indians, the queen of the Montauk Indians, you could say, Olive Farrow, her name was. Wow. I'd sent her the book Pyramids of Montauk, and I called her up to see if she got it, and her sister answered the phone and said she just received the book, but she just went to the hospital with a bleeding gallbladder. She would never recover. So her death was simultaneously with me sending her this book. And then I went to my notes where I was researching the olive and realized her name was Olive, and read that the olive would be used to heal the gallbladder in the future. And it was also used in ancient Atlantis. In the research because I was studying the olive, so it tied right to my research into the Montauk Indians, who, by the way, are tied into the Moors as well, because the Montauk Indians were declared extinct in 1910 by a court order of New York State Supreme Court, and the judge, Abel Blackmar, said that they're not Indians, they're too black to be Indians. These aren't Indians. Which, of course, we know, those who have studied the Moorish studies know that this is a fallacy. Yeah. It was, and so this was, but because I had all these synchronicities with the olive, I had to write the Montauk Book of the Dead because I was having dreams, and the dreams kept leading me to a place in California where my parents were buried, and my parents were actually killed by a drunk driver on the Adobe Los Olivos, or Los Olivos Adobe, which means the Adobe of the olives. They were the Olivos family. They had the biggest ranchero in California in the area of what is now Oxnard, just adjacent to Ventura. And they were killed on that land by a drunk driver, and they were buried on that land, of what was the rancho. So I said, this is commanding me to take attention. But I didn't get it until more dreams led me to Olive Drive, where I began Scientology in Davis, California. It was all on Olive Drive, which was the oldest road in Davis, California. It's still there. It still looks like the oldest road. It was next to the railroad tracks. And the Scientologists had, Martin Samuels, his name was, had rented an old Datsun dealership. Don't look like the Datsun dealer, which is Nissan now. It doesn't look like the dealerships of today, and converted it into a course room and offices, and that's where I got involved in Scientology and had out of the body experiences there. So I felt that I must tell the story of Scientology in my personal life because it predicated my ability to do all my further research in my later life. And that's why the Montauk Book of the Dead was written. It was written long after the fact of having accomplished whatever I accomplished in Scientology, many years after the fact. So it's written with a lot of hindsight.
Okay, so it would be foolish to ask you if you thought everything was just based off of coincidences with all these synchronicities in there. And Olive Farrow, I don't think you mentioned her in the Book of the Dead, but that's the member, the key member of the Moorish, the Montauk tribe that kind of influenced you or inspired you to write the Book of the Dead.
Exactly. In actual, these are 2 books. It was originally supposed to be the Montauk Book of the Living. So I changed. That was going to be the Montauk Book of the Dead because it involved the synchronicities with death. But then these are like the Montauk Book. I had to do 2 books. This is really all one book, the Montauk Book of the Dead and the Montauk Book of the Living, but they're each over 400 pages. So I had to divide them up, and it took me, a year to do each book. So they really go together as a package. As a matter of fact, I have them on the website, skybooks.usa.com. You can go there and you can get the books for half price. You can buy them both at once. They're each $29.95 a piece, but you can buy them at half price right now. two for the price of one, Montauk Book of the Dead and Montauk Book of the Living. And it's 900 pages worth of esoteric adventure. So I hope I've answered your question.
Oh, yes, definitely. So, okay, moving forward, why would you say that writing this book about, or speaking about Montauk, is like opening up a Pandora's box?
Well, the Montauk Project is about mind control using electronics and electromagnetic frequencies for controlling the mind. It's what it's all about. Ultimately, it is involved with manipulating matter, energy, space, and time itself, which is, of course, was one of the goals of Scientology, was to control matter, energy, space, and time. And here you have a group that was trying to accomplish this, and you find out that the government and the secret factions thereof are not only trying to do the same thing, but doing a better job at it than Scientology was. So that's kind of where it is a Pandora's box of, politics, conspiracy, and, humans trying to manipulate other humans. And this is why it's a Pandora's box.
All right. Do you think there's any connection between the Air Force Base being located actually at Montauk Point? I know you spoke on that being used to jam psychic energy. Do you think there's any connection to that and the pyramids or the energy, that was already in that region, before that was established?
Well, Montauk has, it depends how you interpret it, but it's sort of built on a huge pyramid geographically. It's like a huge mountain, and that's geographically. Montauk is at the end of Long Island, but it's really an island unto itself. There's an isthmus called the Napier Strip, which is between the town of Amagansett and Montauk. Now, that's been filled in for years, so if you just drive along it, it's like an extension of Long Island, but it really is an isthmus. And it's not part of geographical Long Island. So Montauk is its whole thing, and there is a place called Montauk Mountain you can find on some maps, which is probably about 6 or 7 miles west of the base, and that's got a big, sort of pyramid. It's a pyramid structure underneath the ground. Preston Nichols, who passed away in October, he said that there was a big pyramid under the town itself. That was according to his research. So, in any case, it was a hot spot geomagnetically and had been watched by secret societies for millennia. And we can only put this in myth and legend that it was allegedly a part of ancient Atlantis. That's really in the mythological realm, but and was told to me that's why the pharaohs who came from Egypt, there were only 3 places that we had the term pharaoh: Montauk, Egypt, and Atlantis. The common denominator between Egypt and Montauk being Atlantis, a more ancient culture. Mm-hmm. And Atlantis is really a catchword for an ancient civilization. It's not a particular island. And this is there is a researcher, Egerton Sykes, who's done more research into Atlantis than anyone, and he picked antique sources. He didn't make the stuff up. He copied it from ancient historical writings. And his stuff is on the web now, Egerton Sykes, EGERTONSYKES.
Okay, I'll definitely look him up later on. There was a link that I meant to send you, but I wanted to know, have you ever heard of the Black Sun, the Pyramid of the Black Sun, or the Black Pyramid? It was found in Ecuador. There's a researcher named Klaus Donna. He's from Austria. I think he used to be a curator at a museum. He does like a lot of research on that. And basically, it's a black stone pyramid. It was probably like 13 inches high. It has 13 steps on it, and then it has like the Eye of Horus at the top where it looks just like the one on the dollar, and then it's got an ancient script on the bottom of it. It's actually been found in various places all over the world, like Italy, Illinois, just in various places. And so
wait, you said 13 inches. Did you mean 13 inches or 13 something else?
Oh, I mean, like how big it is. It's like
you
around
said 13
that
inches.
big, but then it also has 13 steps. It actually looks
No,
like
excuse me. You said it's 13 inches. It's about a foot high.
Yeah, about a foot high.
And several of these have been found around the world, you said?
Well, the script on the bottom of it, the writing has been found all over the world, and they were actually able to translate it. There's another guy in Europe who speaks like various languages. Him and another person who's like from a Berber tribe from North Africa were able to translate it, and I forgot exactly the message that was on it, but just even in that alone, because that Berber tribe, like part of their mythology traces them to an ancient culture, connecting them to Atlantis. And so this, pyramid that looks exactly like the Great Seal on the dollar was found over here in Ecuador.
I've not heard of that black pyramid being discovered in Ecuador. No, I haven't heard of it, and certainly it's interesting.
Yeah, I'll send you the link to that later on. But I wanted to ask you too about Aleister Crowley. I know was someone who had a lot of influence on L. Ron Hubbard, and it's kind of unique if you look into it. Him and Rudolf Hess, and allegedly, can't really say that Prophet Noble Drew Ali was in Egypt because I don't have any, physical documentation of that. But allegedly he was in Egypt around the same time as these two other men, and they all, later on wound up, bringing this information that they learned to their colleagues. So have you ever looked into that at all? What do you make of that?
Well, I wrote a book about that. I was the one that traced the fact that they were, because they both had, I guess, what you'd call geographical position and opportunity to have been in Cairo at the same time. Because if you trace the history of what's available on Drew Ali, he was in Egypt during this period of, I think it was 1903.
Yeah.
And Aleister Crowley was having his honeymoon in 1903. And see, Crowley we know was there historically in 1903 during August 12th, and later came back the following year in 1904 to do the Book of the Law. That was in April of the following year. But that was Crowley. Now, Drew Ali was there sometime around that period. We don't really know. It's not delineated. He was there for a good while. Rudolf Hess was brought up in the city of Alexandria. His father was a wealthy merchant. So I don't know that Hess was in Cairo on that day, but in the book Spandau Mystery, which was written to get at some of the secrets that, you can take things so far with historical fact, and then you start extrapolating on what might have happened, could have happened. So that's what that book is. It's an effort to discover and find out more of what happened, because you're tapping the collective conscious. So anyway, Rudolf Hess could have been there. And in the book, I have him taking a holiday with his father to see the pyramid, and they all end up staying at the same hotel, because it would, and of course, at that point, I think Noble Drew Ali has just been initiated, if I recall, and there's a lot of other characters there that are of esoterica. But that is a fictional assertion to make it interesting, but to tie all the energies together.
Okay. All right. And what book is that you actually it's found?
Spandau Mystery. Spandau Mystery. Spandau. Spandau Mystery. Spandau was the name of the prison where Rudolf Hess and 7 other Nazis were imprisoned, or 6 other Nazis were imprisoned after the Nuremberg trials, and all of them were released except for Hess. They wouldn't release Hess. I go into why they wouldn't release him, because he was the account signatory, and he was also the secretary of the Nazi Party, the financier of the Nazi Party. He raised money for it through his wealthy connections in Bavaria, and he was a signatory on the accounts and knew where accounts were. So he was a great danger to let out, because he had financial signatory power. And this, of course, is not talked about in history. And he was also a technologist, perhaps an amateur technologist, but he was very knowledgeable about the Vril flying craft. He used to give lectures on them. So that was an issue that was brought up in the book. He was also connected to Tibet. And, of course, that's what Spandau is. So he was imprisoned there, was apparently killed. He was very old, but he was. There's books written about how he was killed purposely.
Okay. All right. I also wanted to ask if you could explain, like, from your perspective, the connection of Ong's Hat to Montauk Point, or at least how it came to your attention.
Well, Ong's Hat is a very obscure location in South Jersey. It's about a 2-hour drive from New York City, and maybe a 45-minute drive from Princeton. And Ong's Hat was a location where there was the Princeton scientists. During the time of the 40s, during the Philadelphia experiment days, they had the Ong's Hat Rod and Gun Club, and they used to pool together all of their knowledge and their high-level physics, and they would relax at this location. Now, this location was also tied to a Moorish ashram. Now, the Moorish ashram is even more obscure than the location of Ong's Hat. And let's say Ong's Hat was a community. The way I discovered it was I went to a lecture in New York City of a Peter Lamborn Wilson, because he had written, his name was on something that discussed Ong's Hat. It was a part of a pamphlet, and the name Peter Lamborn Wilson.
And he also goes by Hakim Bey, right?
He does go by Hakim Bey, yes.
Okay.
And he had written a book called Sacred Drift, which is where I discovered Noble Drew Ali, in that book. But Peter Lamborn Wilson, I was interested in him because his name was Wilson, and Wilson is a name that, in my book Montauk Revisited, was a continuous synchronicity generator. And I'm not the only one to have discovered that. There is another man who's written a book called Empire of the Wheel, and unfortunately I can't remember his name right now, but I've read all of his books. He also discovered the name Wilson to be connected with murders along ley lines. The name Wilson kept coming up, and Wilsons were technologists going back to what were called the Sonora flying ships of the 1840s. It was apparently a German technology faction this is in and around the gold country of California. And I only recently discovered that the family name of the Indians there are Wilsons, the royal tribe of the Montauk Indians. Now, the Wilsons married into them. And so the name Wilson keeps coming up. So I was early on in my Wilson research. I wanted to go see Peter Lamborn Wilson. I wanted to hear his lecture, and I asked him about Ong's Hat, and he was very impressed that I knew something more about it than just was typical. But he didn't say too much. And later I would run into the sort of the instigator of all the Ong's Hat information that was on the web, Joseph Matheny, and he had strange encounters with it. But I encountered it in terms of seeking out synchronicity of the name Wilson, and also I knew people who were aware of the ashram. It disappeared eventually.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
And it was tied to something. Peter Lamborn Wilson talked up something called the Moorish Orthodox Church. The Moorish Orthodox Church was sort of a CIA-affiliated attempt to co-opt the consciousness of the Moorish element, and it operated, to the best of my knowledge, out of Millbrook, New York, which is where Timothy Leary had his headquarters. Leary was tied into the Moorish Orthodox Church as well.
Wow. Okay. All right. Thanks for explaining that. Okay. Back to the Montauk tribe. To your knowledge, have they received any remedy since the 1909 ruling? We did actually on our YouTube channel a short documentary about that. And as he was speaking on that earlier, just to rehash that for those who don't know, you actually had several members of the Montauk tribe sitting in the courtroom in the Supreme Court in New York when Judge Abel Blackmar declared the tribe extinct. The chief of the tribe, Pharaoh, David Pharaoh, I believe, or Wyandotte Pharaoh, was sitting right there, and they actually declared the tribe extinct, even though several local people from the area recounted calling him chief or king or tribe.
Oh, there were lots of them, and they just said, they just did. I mean, it was a very racist.
Yeah.
Long Island was a very racist place up through at least the 1920s, and there were even parts of Yaphank, Long Island, which is where the Nazi compound was, where you had to be German to live there until as late as the 1880s. And pretty soon they had to give it up because the racism just has been continually dying out in America. But it was very strong, and young people of today don't really realize what racism really is or was. And of course, growing up in the 60s, you definitely experienced it, but it must have been much worse in the 20s and back then in 1910. You just forget about it. So they declared the Indians extinct, and the so yes, that was a great travesty that was committed against not only the Montauks but the Moors themselves, because there was a lack of acknowledgement of who the Moors were, which is just as bad as the other one.
Okay. How did you come to the conclusion that the Montauk tribe were Moors?
Well, it goes back into a Delaware case. It goes back. They tied to Delaware because the Montauks tied to the Lenni Lenape of Delaware, and the first case of Moors coming up in the judicial literature of the United States was a Delaware Moor. So it was very obvious that the Delaware Moors were tied to the Lenni Lenape, which the Lenni Lenape were one faction of the Montauk Indians. I think there were three totems. One was the Lenni Lenape, which I think represented, it was the turkey and the turtle. I think it was the wolf. And I don't remember which was which, but the Lenni Lenape were one of them. And, of course, I learned this from the shaman of the Montauks as far as the three totems. But, yes, I found that in literature. The Delaware Moors were Lenni Lenape, and that's where the Lenni Lenape came from. So there was a big Delaware connection. And then it becomes rather obvious, why are there... See, there's also the cousins of the Montauks are the Shinnecocks. They are known as black Indians, although they're not all black Indians. Yes. And it's kind of like when you move to Long Island and you grow up in the culture that we grew up in, you think, well, why are all these Indians black? It doesn't make any sense from what you read in history books. And then you start putting two together. Well, now we know why they're all black. They make up stories about them being amalgamated with slaves. When I met the shaman's mother, the shaman of the Montauk Indians, she's sort of like a light, her skin's very like a light chocolate. She has a son who looks dark. She has a son who's an albino. And I met her mother, and her mother looked like she was white, you know. Mm-hmm. And I told her mother, I said, well, I didn't expect. And she says, oh, no, we're all in it. We're all colors. You know, she says, Indians are all colors. You know, so it's, and as the medicine man of the Montauks, Artie Crippen, he says that he's got, like, his family, he said, like, all of his brothers and sisters are all got different designations on their driver's license. You know, one's declared a Native American, one's called black, one's called Caucasian, one's probably called Asian. He's half Asian himself. You know, so it's like they got all these, like, you know, it doesn't make any, you're looking at one family and they don't all fit into one stereotype. So it became sort of obvious that this Moorish connection and that the Montauks came from Egypt. There's a lot more, I guess what you call synchronistic tie-ins that point to a association of the Montauks, not only with the Moors, but with the Welsh people as well, the Welsh Indians, and that came up, and the Mandan Indians, who are Welsh Indians, white, blue-eyed Indians that came up the Delta from Mobile Island in Alabama, or Alibaba, and they came up the Mississippi, settled in Tennessee, Kentucky, where all these place names of King Arthur and Prince Montauk. They made their way up to Montana, became the Mandan Indians, eventually over to California, where they're known as Modoc Indians, which is hauntingly similar to the name Prince Montauk, which was the brother of King Arthur, according to the research of Alan Wilson.
Okay. Yeah.
And so, and Prince Montauk, I figured, was probably a transliteration of a character called Montauk Pharaoh, who is not a historical character in the books. It's from the Montauk medicine man who told me there was Montauk Pharaoh, was a pharaoh in Egypt who came over, escaped Egypt and came over to Montauk, where he was the pharaoh of the Montauks. He said that's how that got started. And he might be the same character as Prince Montauk, who supposedly came from Egypt and, you know, made his way up to, you know, England, we know now as the United Kingdom.
Okay. All right. And when you were speaking on the way people in the tribes get reclassified, you can see that, too, in the work of Jack D. Forbes. He writes about a lot how you had people who, even during their lifetime, sometimes their birth certificate will say one race or ethnicity, and then, you know, by the time they're older, you know, they'll say something else on the census. But back on it, and also one of the famous rapper, Old Dirty Bastard, he was of Shinnecock descent. Actually, a lot of the Wu-Tang Clan were, and his grandfather was Paul Cuffey, who was like one of the last pure blood, they say, chiefs of the tribe, the Shinnecock.
I've heard of Paul Cuffey. I've heard that name, yes, and I think it appears in a book that I have on the history of the Montauks.
Yeah, and then for somebody like Old Dirty Bastard, if you ever heard of him, to say stuff like that, people just took him as crazy, you know? So he didn't get any recognition, actually, for that at all. Sorry about that. And I actually have another question about that. When you were speaking about the shaman of the Montauks, saying that their relatives came from Egypt, I'm a member of the Moorish Science Temple of America, and within the Holy Quran in chapter 47 about Egypt being the capital of dominion, we're actually told that the Moabites received permission from the Pharaoh to come over here to the Americas to settle or to set up colonies, so to speak. Have you seen anything in your research that correlates with that? And especially in light of the Montauks saying that their ancestors came from Egypt.
Well, where Sharon Jackson, the shaman, she said she read it in a book when she was small. She could never find the book. She's never been able to produce the book. But she's not the only one to share that. Some of them don't believe it, but what they believe, many of them have been, more or less programmed by what they've read in school. And the medicine man warned me of something called a book Indian. And a book Indian is somebody who's a Native American who studied too many books written by white people.
Yeah.
And he thinks he knows things because he's read them in books, as opposed to ancient and oral tradition. So to get back to your question of whether, the pharaohs authorized the Moabites to come here, I think there is a migration that has taken place from, the old world to the so-called New World, and it goes in sequences and series. So it's very, and then we've been taught a very sanitized history, that everything happened from 1492 onward, which is the date of the expulsion of the Moors from Spain, and it's a very false history. So when you go back into, I guess what you call some of the history that the Mormons write about, which is very hard to.
So if you just hang on, we'll get things back up. Don't go anywhere. Okay, all right. Peter
Moon. Peter Moon. Hello?
Hey, Peter. Hey, thanks for calling back in. I'm not sure what happened. You just...
I got cut off my internet. I got cut off my phone. I don't know what the hell happened.
Okay.
I've never seen anything like it before. I started running diagnostics. I guess, I don't know if I fixed it or it just came back on, because it certainly didn't make any sense to me. But anyway, I'm back.
Yeah, you were going in, and it just, all of a sudden, we couldn't hear you, man. Sorry about that.
I don't think it was your fault, but whatever. So I was talking about the history of, you were asking me about the Moabites.
Yes.
And whether they had authorized the people coming over here to represent, Morocco or whatever. And as I say, there's a series of migrations that have taken place. I was saying the Mormons go into that in their history, which is hard to reconcile on some levels. Nevertheless, It's just one instance of ancient peoples coming over here, populating this area into antiquity. So I would say that if the pharaohs of Egypt did indeed do that, it's kind of like, when did they do it, and what was the reference frame? Because there's probably earlier forefathers of theirs and later descendants of theirs who more or less did the same thing. That's just my opinion. So when you try and, assign a certain authority to something, it's lost in antiquity, and this is how things work. So right now we have people who should have a legitimate claim to this world if we're going to divide it into territories, but it sort of becomes pale because the ruling authority is the ruling authority, and it's like it's whether it's good or bad, it's the ruling authority, so it kind of doesn't do one much good. One is lucky, like say the Aga Khan, who is sort of like a sort of homeless in terms of his status of what he, or his, he does have a kingdom, but it's not a really much of a geographical kingdom, I don't think. I think it's just a kingdom of wealth, the Aga Khan, who was the descendant of the assassins.
Yeah. Okay.
So what good does a pedigree do you if you can't exercise it? It's all about power.
Yeah.
Secular power.
Yeah, it makes sense. And it's just even the name that we were given in the Quran for the ancient name for Africa, or even for this landmass as well, of a Mexum. You can't find that anywhere else.
Well, you find it in Moorish history, and I mean, you said that you're a member of the Moorish Science Temple. Which city are you in?
I'm actually in Columbus, Ohio. I'm a member of Temple 12 in Toledo, Ohio.
Okay. I've been with, and this is years ago, spoke with the Moors in Washington, D.C. It was affiliated with one of the temples, and also in Chicago. And I spent more time with the people in Chicago than I did in D.C. But and I don't know that any of the people I met with were hardcore members of the temple, but they were definitely Moors. We didn't really get into the temple. They didn't talk about the temple because the people that were facilitating me, Sid Catlett, wasn't a member of temples. But these people were so knowledgeable, and not knowledgeable in a, I guess what you call regimented or parochial way. They were knowledgeable on real history. They didn't talk about certain things that couldn't be authenticated.
Yeah.
They knew about laws. I was so impressed with their knowledge and wisdom. But the the whole thing about, I mean, there is a certain trace history that goes back to Morocco with the United States, but it falls apart. A lot of it, a lot of the more interesting stuff in trying to trace that is this mandate they talk about that was in the Pan-American conference in Cuba with Noble Drew Ali. That was an actual conference that he attended, and he was supposedly had some land grant or something that showed that that this land was ceded to or borrowed from the Moors. It was like an acknowledged lease, and that after this was when all these countries started calling in their loans from the United States because the land they were on was questionable, and this caused the financial panic of 1929 and beyond. When I first heard that story, it sounded preposterous, but when you look deeper into it, there is a lot of obscure history there. So, and of course, these things can vanish. I've seen stuff vanish before. So, whether it's demons or people in the right places taking it and the wrong places taking it, there's probably a lot of obscure history about the Moors, and you'd probably find a great deal of it buried in the Vatican, because the Vatican was very hateful of Moors and very hateful of cats, which go hand in hand with the Moors. Yeah. I mean, they used to kill cats and throw them off of towers, and it was they associated the cats with witchery. So,
if I could pause right there and ask you if you could explain more on that, because within the book you said something that I haven't really heard anywhere else about Feliz Navidad, meaning birth of the cat, and I mean it made sense, with Felix being in Latin.
Well, yes. Well, see, Feliz means felicity, or in Feliz Navidad is Merry Christmas, Merry Birth, Happy Birth. What in Portuguese they say Bon Natal, good birth, happy birth. In Spanish it's Feliz Navidad, and Feliz is very tied to the word Felix and feline. It's all tied etymologically. So that's just one reference to the birth of the cat. But Jesus has always been associated with the cat. He's called the Lion of Judea in the Bible. He was identified as Jesus ben Pandera in the Talmud. He comes from the line of Pandera, which refers to the panther. He was portrayed in occult circles for years as a panther, maybe a leopard. But and there are other references. Even the word Leo Leo is tied to the cat, and Leo is tied to the sun, and Apolleo, which is the uncovering of the sun. And Kabbalistically, Apollo is related to Tiparet or Tipareth, which is the sun. So he's always been associated with the cat. And of course, in astrology, Leo is the most exalted sign of the zodiac. It's the king of the zodiac. So that's why, the birth of the cat, this refers to it. There are other deeper references to it, but that's enough to give you a summarized definition of why Feliz Navidad ties to the birth of the cat.
Yeah, definitely. And I like how you tie that in too with the lion's grip as well.
Well, yeah, that goes into the deeper, because King Solomon, in the legend of Masonry, Hiram Abiff was the builder of the temple, and they tried to kill him for his secrets. The three ruffians tried to get the secrets. This is a Masonic ritual that's acted out based upon an archetypal myth. And the three ruffians kill him, try to wound him. They finally kill him. And King Solomon orders them to be resurrected. Nobody can resurrect Hiram Abiff, the builder of the temple, till he finally uses what is called the lion's grip or the lion's paw. And that lion's paw represents 5 fingers. And this is something in Esoterica, which is called the ratio of the paws to the claws in regards to the Sphinx. The Sphinx has 4 paws and 5 claws. And this is the relationship between 4 and 5, which represents 4 represents the tetrahedron, which corresponds to something in the Bible called tetragrammaton, which means 4 letters, Yod He Vav He, the word, the name of God, which equates to Yahweh or Jehovah. And then you have the 5, which is the pentagrammaton, meaning 5 letters. Pentagrammaton, grammaton is letters, penta is 5. And that represents to not just Yod He Vav He, but Yod He Shin Vav He, Shin being the 5th, which is the secret hidden word of Freemasonry. And that is the secret core to the lion's grip. Shin means spirit, it means change, and that is it's the 5th element. It activates the Hiram Abiff, and this is how King Solomon himself with the lion's grip. It's all intense symbology.
Yes, definitely. And back to the Montauk tribe, I remember you saying also in the book that there was a member of the Moorish Science Temple of America that was, I guess you could say, sponsoring the Montauks, like their quest to be recognized by the government. Could you speak on that?
Well, you did ask me earlier about if anything had happened with the Montauks. There was I don't know about any member of the Moorish Science Temple right now helping the Montauks. I don't recall specifically what that's about. But there was an effort by the State Assembly of New York that actually recognized the Montauks, and the Senate went on board with it. So you had the legislature of New York State acknowledging the Montauks. This is about 4 or 5 years ago.
Okay.
And it was all set to recognize them. And Governor Cuomo vetoed it. Wow. He vetoed it, and he said, well, we have to study this. It has to be studied by the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State never studied it. So it was just a way to kill the bill. So we can blame the Governor Cuomo. It actually got through the legislature. So, we're dealing with political corruption at the highest levels of New York State, which is in the personage of the governor. This just tells you that the man is just evil. Regardless of what else he's up to. Yeah. And I wouldn't say he's 100% evil, because he is running New York State and he's running people. But this is just like I wouldn't want to have that on my conscience if I was him. Mm-hmm. So that's and there's just this thing is is a big, big deal. It's so big. And right now we're dealing with all of this crazy politics in America. And the craziest thing about the politics, without going into taking sides, is that there's no meaningful prosecutions of either side. Yeah. There's token prosecutions of small-time players. Mm-hmm. So, you see, you don't have anybody being prosecuted. You don't have any rule of law that applies to the elite. We supposedly have sealed indictments that are indeed quite real, but we don't know who's going to be indicted. And this is supposed to be released in January simultaneously, so you could see, maybe you'll see half of Congress being indicted. I doubt that will happen. Yeah. So, or it might just be a bunch of drug dealers. Who the hell knows? I mean, it's like I'm very cynical about what might happen. But things don't change, stay the same forever. So,
definitely. So, okay, this is my speculation, just from what I got from the Montauk Book of the Dead. Would you say that that what is happening, specifically with the Montauk, tribe, is tied into, what are all of our fates, or what's happening with us on a greater level? Because, like, within the book, when you're speaking about how the Egyptians say that only a new pharaoh can restore Mayat, and within that same book, you're saying that pretty much the only people known on Earth, that were in that position to claim pharaohship would be the Montauk tribe.
Well, that's an excellent question, and see, what it works like this. If you go in to study the court case against the Montauks, as I did, you begin to encounter the number 666 in the dockets, in the dates of the deeds, and all this sort of thing, even to the point when I went up to look up the deed in the Suffolk County, archives, or whatever they call it, is the car opposite mine when I pulled in the parking lot was the exact year and color of my Ford Mustang. At the time, I had a Ford Mustang, and the license plate they had was 666. That's just like the synchronicity of it. Yeah. And then you start looking at all these dates of the court cases, and it's 666. Now, 666 refers to carbon. This is a carbon-based universe, and the carbon atom has 6 protons, 6 neutrons, and 6 electrons. So what this means is that the Montauk pharaohs and I guess what you call the denigration of them is proportional to the amount of introversion of spirit into matter. Spirit into matter is symbolized by the upside-down pentagram, whereas the upright pentagram is spirit over matter. This is why Satanists use the inverted pentagram. Yes. Pentagram. So basically, Montauk, as a negative structure, is a complete inversion of matter over spirit. This is why. So when you have the Montauk Indians as a race are literally, or as a tribe, are in a crucified state as a tribe. That doesn't mean, in terms of what their true power is. Their power has been crucified. The individuals go about their lives however they go about them. But this is like a racial, tribal indignation that's just impressed upon them. And the only way you can rise from a crucifixion is to rise from the dead. So that's kind of what we're dealing with. So the symbology of Montauk is this is what the whole project is and everything. So when we talk about lifting that up, it's like this is the predicament of the whole physical universe. People are indoctrinated into physicality and they can't get out of it. And they're stuck in it, and they're living in this 3D world, and they become consumers. And, being a consumer is something you do to get through life. However, if you're just stuck in that band of consuming, that's all you ever are. You have to rise above it. You have to be above it. So this is like, Montauk is a wonderful metaphor for what's wrong with this, and it ties in very deeply to the things we've just discussed. Like, with resurrection, the shin, it's like a principle which just rivets us into the, more uncomfortable aspects of living in the material universe.
Thank you for sharing that. Okay, I have another question too. In the book, you spoke on how many of the early presidents, I say before George Washington, or presidents of the Continental Congress were Moors. What led you to that conclusion?
Well, that's history that I've read. John Hanson, who I do mention, is one of the most controversial and lied about characters. Whether he's being lied about by, this faction or that faction, I can't tell. But there's ties of Washington even being tied to the Moors, being part Moorish, or part, his family. And this is part of this is, and I think I once spoke to a man named Joe Washington. I think he was from Washington State, and he was white, and he was like the only white Washington I'd ever met.
Yeah.
Because all Washingtons are black. I mean, there's tons of them.
Yeah.
And so how in the hell? They're not related ostensibly to George Washington. There's no white Washingtons. So you have, the Washita Empire, and of course I learned about that as well, the Washita Empire. So that's a whole nother obfuscation of history. Mm-hmm. Of course, and the whole Constitution of America is based upon the Iroquois. Now, what I learned from one of my Moorish friends, Tecumseh Brown Eagle, taught me that I-R, is an iteration for the cat. He comes from Erie, Erie, who's the Erie tribe with the cat people, Iroquois with the cat people. Yeah. So you even have an ancient land called In the Bible, it's called Ur. You have Iraq, Iran. You have Erin meaning Ireland. Mm-hmm. All of these things tie to the cat, which it all makes sense because the cat is the is the king of the zodiac.
Mm-hmm. And you also mentioned that, like, kind of indirectly, the Constitution is kind of based off of isonomy, like ancient Moorish doctrine.
No, I said Iroquois. I don't know if I mentioned. I don't remember that. But I mean, it might well be. It was based off of what?
The isonomy. This is like an ancient Moorish doctrine, kind of. Okay,
I remember that now. Yeah, oh yeah. That I would like to find out more about. Yeah, I do remember that now.
All right, and okay. Also, we did have a question from the chat, from the people that are listening in. Would you mind if I ask that now?
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Somebody wanted to know if you could go in, or if you could expound on the Moorish history in America before and after 1492.
Well, that's. I don't consider myself equipped to really address that, because whatever I do know is limited and it's not fresh on my mind. I think where it stands out, where I would go after it, is when I was talking about Prince Montauk, which that appears in the Montauk Book of the Living, and the strain of Egypt, which comes. There is an argument to be made that Egyptians settled the British Isles, or influenced the British Isles with Scota. Scotland is named after Scota, the daughter of the pharaoh. And then you have Prince Madoc, coming from Egypt. If there is this Montauk pharaoh came, and he was Prince Madoc, he came from Egypt. He went to the British Isles, and then came to Montauk. That's how he would have traveled. And, whether his brother was King Arthur or not, this is the work of Alan Wilson. He's done quite a lot of research on this. He can be found on the net and in his books. And all these place names of King Arthur and Prince Madoc in and around Kentucky and Tennessee. So there have been other people that have studied the migration of, and where do you, what is a Moor? Where do you call a Moor? A Moor is a designation. It's a very broad designation. What first impressed me about Moors, the first time I encountered them, was in a movie called The Longships, starring Sidney Poitier and Richard Widmark. Richard Widmark being a Viking who crash lands on the Moorish coast, and he has an encounter with the Moors. But the thing that struck me as a young man watching this movie was that the Moorish army had white and black warriors, and there was no distinguish or reference of race. I said, what the hell is this? You don't see this in a movie. You don't see black fighting. Usually you'd see blacks fighting in a, Ramar of the Jungle, fighting, and you wouldn't find them fighting alongside whites in an ancient, paradigm. Yeah. And my father explained to me, he says, no, Moors didn't have that. That was not, they didn't have a racial issue with that. And that was my first introduction. It was not a skin thing, although it became a skin thing. It wasn't initially, or at least at that period of history. So you have different parties, different factions, often identifying with the cat, and the name Moros in Rome was from the Greek moresh, which was from Mao, the Egyptian word for cat, and resh, the Egyptian word for head or king. So you had the moresh were the cat heads or the cat kings, and so it's a very broad, and you'll find people named after cats, but you'll also find people named after other animals as well. But it's a designation that indicates an ancient time of felicity and positiveness, and that's what so many people identify with. And they also, and the antagonists identify with the opposite. Let's kill the Moors, let's kick them out of Catholic Spain, let's defeat the feminine energy, let's kill the cats. Yeah. It all goes hand in hand.
Definitely. So, okay, bringing it back here to North America, concerning the Moors, has your research provided any insight into the circumstances surrounding the transition of the Prophet Noble Drew Ali?
The transition, meaning his leaving
the death, yeah, leaving the physical form.
I guess it depends on who you talk to. There's nothing definitive. The most interesting thread on that was from Elihu Pleasant Bay, who did the book on Noble Drew Ali. And much of that information he told me. He stayed with me. He attended the book conference with me one year. We lived together for a few days and shared the same table. He knew Noble Drew Ali's, one of his wives, and he got a lot of information from her. Noble Drew Ali does have a descendant. He had multiple wives, and he had granddaughters.
Wow.
I hoped that I would have, been able to meet them or contact them, and I even mentioned in the book that I was looking forward to that, but I've not heard anything about or from them. And sometimes people can carry a lineage like that, and they may have no, it's like being, the son of Willie Mays and having no relative baseball ability. Yeah. It just, you know what I mean? It doesn't necessarily, the fact that you come from a genetic line doesn't necessarily mean that you are that thing that your father or your mother or grandfather was. Sometimes you are, sometimes you're not.
Yeah. Did they go underground? Because I never even heard.
I just don't know. It was obscure.
Wow.
And it was obscure, and I kind of lost touch with him. I still get emails from him, or what do you call it, blanket stuff that he sends out. But I didn't get any headway with that as far as finding that out. I want to say that her name was Pearl. So I don't know if that was
one. It was his wife, Pearl. Wow.
Yeah, and one time I was driving through Ohio, not far from where you live, with the medicine man. We were driving back from Michigan, and he says, "It's okay if we go to Akron. I want to see, Aunt Roma." And I said, "Sure." Now it's an hour and a half out. It's out of the way. It's at least I don't know, maybe 45 minutes. I don't know. It's taken a couple hours off our journey, and then we get to Roma's house, and of course, then we're going to be fed and this and that, and it turns into a whole, which I didn't mind at all, but I was so incredibly gifted and honored to in that house, and he didn't know it was a lady called Miss Kitty. Miss Kitty was a Montauk Indian. I forget who she came from on the Montauks, but she was like a matriarch, and she was related to Nat Turner. She was related. Now, Nat Turner is, of course, he's part of the Washita. He's even, according to one theory, related to the Dauphin of France, or his ancestry was the Dauphin of France. So, which is a whole Moorish connection in and of itself. But here was a Montauk Indian matriarch who was related to Nat Turner. And you had right there in that moment in Akron, I'm seeing the bloodline from Montauk going right into the Washita Empire.
Wow.
And that's just wow. I was so honored to meet her. And, she could have been my aunt, the way I was treated. But it's just, that's the magic of the moment, saying, hey, this is all real. But, of course, we live in a world where, we just have this power patriarchy that, insists on, like this mindset of let's feed the people in Mexico, but let's let everybody starve in the tent cities here. This humanity is politically orchestrated. It's like it's this whole inhumane paradigm that we live in with power politics, which extends all the way back into history of, killing other people and us first, everybody else.
Yeah. Not
even second, but this is just the way the world, and it all represents that downward spiral I was alluding to earlier about, getting fixated into the material plane and all that all the negativity that it can perpetrate.
Yeah, and ultimately, I think like within just with what the Prophet Noble Drew Ali brought with the Holy Quran, ultimately, it's to help you, break out of that cycle and to prepare us for even not just to fix our earthly plights, but to reveal, higher truth so that you can expand beyond that. And when you were speaking of Brother Elihu Pleasant Bay, I actually know him, Swift Angel. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and he's the first person to ever say anything about Moorish nationality or anyone. Nobody ever told me that, our nationality and identity had been stripped from us. So he's one of the ones that helped to raise me up into that information.
Yes, and it's not only been stripped, stripped from the Moors, it's been stripped out of the history books. And, they talk about fake news. Well, we've had fake history. and I saw some people going at it. I won't even get in these debates because they're so stupid. They were arguing about the historicity of Jesus, and it's like the only way. I mean, there's been so much literature created about that, just like there's been so much literature created about King Arthur. Does that mean King Arthur's real? Not in the sense that he's written about. So it's like there's been a lot of stuff, written about Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is there's so much conviction put into it that it becomes real for people.
Yeah.
It's like, and it's not. So anyway, or maybe it is, and everything's real in some other universe. However, with this, the only way you can prove this stuff, whether it be the historicity of Jesus or these Moorish questions that you and others legitimately have, is this is where we get into the time travel. It's like, can we go back and can we examine history and can we really see and objectify it? And of course, if you can actually do that, it's sort of unnecessary, because when you've arrived at that state, like do we really need to go back and see where Tesla went to school to show that he was qualified to do what he did? No.
Yeah.
Nobody cares. So this is the thing. So if you can be fluid throughout history and you can go back and you have the power to go back, and it's not like you're going to be running back into the present time and saying, well, we found out that the Moors really own this piece of land and you don't, or that Jesus really did exist, so your religion's wrong. I mean, that's kind of what it gets reduced down to. It's like if you have that ability to go back and verify, you'd probably go back and find out that things are nowhere near the way they appear from having read literature.
Yeah.
It's kind of like if you go back and read the history of a famous baseball game or football game or Super Bowl or something like that. You can go back and read the history, and it sounds very poetic, but it would be a completely different experience than sitting in the stands or being in the game. And when you're getting involved in in this type of history, you're going to find out it's oh so different, and you might find that nobody really knew what they were doing. Nobody really didn't. If you went back there and found yourself in the year 0 to 100 AD and were able to travel around, you might find that it's not like you thought it was, and that anything you tried to do to change it, you might be frustrated because of the mindset of the people who were doing what they were doing were so stuck in their ways that there wasn't necessarily an opportunity for you to say, if you do it this way, you're going to screw up the next millennium, and they might look at you like, who the hell are you? So.
Yeah, and the people who did kind of have that mentality in these different ages, they were so far ahead of their time, they wouldn't even have been accepted.
Well, yeah, exactly, and we don't know what manipulations are going on there, but history. As I grow older in this world, I find that so much of what I've experienced becomes, just in my own mind, becomes transmuted into something other than the way it looked 10 or 20 years ago. In other words, there's certain points of history that just kind of like, oh, okay, it's like if you look at the history of milk, milk was once a certain way when you got milk out of a cow.
Yeah.
And then it became homogenized, and then they pumped vitamins into it. So, for example, my wife comes from Romania, and she cannot stand the milk here. Yeah. She says, what the hell is this? This isn't milk. So not until she goes to a farm and pays $7 for a half gallon of milk will she feel like she has something that's representative of real milk. Because when you're in Romania, you're drinking out of a cow practically.
Yeah.
So this is so that's milk. That's the history of milk. What happened to milk? It's the same thing with history. It becomes diluted. It becomes homogenized. So this is the problem with we're dealing in history, but that's also the way life works. So in other words, you might think of, all the girlfriends you had, and then look back and say, well, this one was this, and you just only certain things stand out about them, and it might just stood out that, maybe you shouldn't get involved with redheads because you always have bad experience with redheads or something, just because that's your own thing or whatever, or you shouldn't be involved with, girls of this religion or that persuasion because they just don't work for you. So that's all that might stand out about them, when in actual fact there was all this detail that you were involved with. So, history gets summarized by us, and you can only kind of conclude things, and on a collective basis, it's the same thing.
That makes a lot of sense. I agree. I do have another question. I think that there's a Moorish resurgence or reawakening going on right now. There's a lot of people who are labeled as African American who are starting to think outside the box and starting to think that maybe they shouldn't go with those labels. And so a lot of people are coming into this information with Prophet Noble Drew Ali, and there's not really any support for this. Like, there's really no logical reason for this to be happening. I mean, it's not like there's government funding behind it. I mean, the only reason they would know is because of people like Aliyu Pleasant Bay, people like you writing about this. There's another brother named Hakeem Bey out of New York who's been teaching for years, Taj Tariq Bey, and then just like a handful of people who've been keeping the temples, more science temples of America, open, like Supreme Grand Sheikh D. Bailey Ill. And I just wanted to give a shout out to him. So there's not really any reason, like, logically for this to be occurring, because there's people like all over the nation.
Well, look at it from this way. After communism fell in 1989,
mm-hmm.
one of the most surprising things to me, not being from these countries, was watching how the countries that made up the Soviet Union, such as Lithuania, Latvia, Belarusia, and other countries I'm not naming, they all had a national identity.
Yeah.
And it was all screw you, Russia, was part of the national identity.
Yeah.
But they had their own identity, which had been taken from them by the Soviet Union. And I said, but this is like hundreds of years ago it was taken. Yeah. Well, maybe not hundreds of years ago, but the generation that was protesting was saying, hey, this is who we are. We want our identity back.
Yeah.
And it spanned generations. That surprised me. Now, I can tell you from a friend of mine who was recently in China and in Inner Mongolia. Mm-hmm. She's Romanian. And she told me how the Chinese have been so stripped of their they love anything that's American, like just food that's American. She said the food was horrible. It was all like, it was so bad that she was trying to do holistic stuff, and the food was full of so much crap, and the air was crappy. And she said that the people were fascinated to learn about their own history in China. She knew more about it than they did.
Wow. And
she's teaching them their history, and they're fascinated. Now, this is in Inner Mongolia, a big city in Inner Mongolia, and the same thing happened. She was working at a co-op in China, which was, the pits, apparently. So, in other words, it's like people have, it's in their DNA. So if and see, I can only say sort of from the outside, I have seen the culture of Black America improve so much over my lifetime in terms of it not being disenfranchised like it was in the 50s and 60s when I grew up.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
I was once, in 1987, I went to Cancun, and I saw a black person at the hotel, and I was in culture shock because I said, oh, that's a black person having a vacation. I'm thinking like, I'm like, oh, black people have vacations? Because, first off, when I was on vacation, I never really saw them. Not that I really went to that many vacation spots, but I said, oh, that's great. They can have vacations too. It's kind of like, because the mindset was so cut off, you know. So you know, and of course,
well, a lot of our people were in survival mode. Not to cut you off. So yeah,
no. Well, they were in survival mode, to say nothing of that. And you know, I read the stories of Dick Gregory and how he grew up, and how hard it was, but you see, and even the mood of black people where I live is so pleasant. It's like there's no. New York is good for that, you know, for multi-ethnicity, but it's like they're, you know, like it's just like I don't feel the racial buzz that maybe I would have felt 10, 15 years ago. Things have improved.
Yeah.
It's not perfect, but it's improved. And so that gives people a freedom to look further and say, well, you know, and we've had a black president. So, you know, it's like, regardless of what his drawbacks are, it still says, hey, this is, everybody's equal. And then it gives people an incentive to think and to free and to look. Now, what I would say is, our friend Mr. Ford, who wrote to you, he has enlightened me to the work of Paul Guthrie. And Paul Guthrie gives some pretty extensive YouTube information on Wallace Farad, or Wali Fard, the founder of the Nation of Islam. And this sort of turns things upside down for what people have been taught about the Nation of Islam. And he's not necessarily liked by people in all quarters of the Nation of Islam, but his work is you know, he will challenge anybody for scholarship. Paul Guthrie, and so that puts a different spin. And this Mr. Ford character has put a different spin on Moorish heritage as it comes on the character of Wali Farad, and who really Wali Farad really was. He is not the character that shows up in the FBI file. He is not the character who we think he is. And I have written, I should send the article I wrote on it to you rather than going into it now because it's been a while. Mm-hmm. But in other words, he is not the, he's just not the character that we thought he was. And I say that the actual person would come out in a much more complimentary fashion if you were to take all the stories about him and put them all together versus what I know now, or what I've learned now, versus what I initially heard about him. So that's and I also wanted to ask you a question with regards to Louis Farrakhan.
Sure.
Louis Farrakhan, he, from what I know, he became involved in Scientology, first learned of it in 2006. Yeah. My book came out in 2005, which and then in about 2011, he starts to advocate Scientology. Do you have any inside knowledge on how he became involved with Scientology?
Well, I was going to ask you the same thing. I mean,
okay, there is a character.
I know that they.
There is a character. I don't remember his name, who's very active in Scientology, who introduced him to it, according to what I've read on the net. I just don't remember the man's name. He's an active Scientologist who introduced aspects of it to Louis Farrakhan. Okay. And then Louis Farrakhan began to publicly acknowledge Noble Drew Ali, which was very smart. Yeah. What I have noticed with Louis Farrakhan, of course, he's ripped to shreds by people for his involvement in Scientology and stuff like this. And but the thing is, since he got into Scientology, what I noticed is he cut down on the anti-Jewish rhetoric. Mm-hmm. He cut down on it, although I think he might have recently did some, and he acknowledged Noble Drew Ali. Now, publicly acknowledged him.
Yeah.
And to me, these were very smart things to do from a PR standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, you don't want to be riling the feathers of Jewish people if you want to, increase your. And it's a double-edged sword because if you're looking at them as antagonists or somebody who've destroyed your culture, then you kind of have to. You can't sell out to your base, your political base. But there is a character who got him involved in 2006 and probably had his ear and did a number on him. And I saw, I guess what I would say, some more strategically conciliatory rhetoric coming out of him. And oddly enough, and I would say if the subject of Scientology is ever to be resurrected and turned into something that could be useful on a wide basis, it would come out of the Moorish element and the Moorish connection. Whether that's connection to the Nation of Islam or not, it could be, could not be, because people are in the Nation of Islam that aren't necessarily, they don't fit a stereotype. They might just be in there by title, and they might have much more to them than that. I've met them. So, and there's people that are followers of that, or original followers who don't ascribe to Louis Farrakhan. So the connection is very interesting. It puzzles the hell out of ex-Scientologists. It puzzles the hell out of them. It does not puzzle me, although I don't know the ins and outs of him. I do know that he quoted certain things from my book, didn't give me credit when this Million Man March. I was told that, and it does, of course, it doesn't offend me. I'm flattered that he would, So I don't know what that's all about. I was hoping you might have more information on that. Of course, we can dig down that rabbit hole if we want to. I don't know where it ends up.
Well, the only thing that I could say is that, because I did attend the Million Man March in 2015, and there was a considerable amount of Moors there wearing a fez, and he invited some to come out on stage and speak. Then I know he spoke about the Prophet Noble Drew Ali at Savior's Day. That's probably what you're speaking about a few years ago. As far as the connection with Scientology, I mean, the Nation of Islam is kind of secretive about that. I mean, they just speak on the auditing process. And from what I heard, from different people who've spoken on it, that's pretty much what they say. That's the only thing that they admit to, co-opting or to, using from Scientology. But yeah, I can't really offer any other insight because I don't know. I can send you a link though, where there's some a brother from the Nation of Islam speaking on it. But yeah, I was going to ask you the same thing. But
well, the thing is, I had to really do a double take when I included the stuff in the Montauk Book of the Dead about the Moors. Mm-hmm. Because I wrote the book Synchronicity and the Seventh Seal, and that book, these things are available on skybooks.usa.com. Synchronicity and the Seventh Seal was a book I wrote to sort of exercise all the demons from all the research I'd done into time travel and the Montauk Indians, and it was clearing the energy. And for whatever reason, I made a tribute to the Moors because they came up in my psyche. I didn't even know there was a Moorish science temple anymore. I didn't know it existed. I thought it was something in antiquity that died with Drew Ali, and then it all turned into the Nation of Islam. And then so when I wrote the book Synchronicity and the Seventh Seal, I was contacted by a man named Elias Bay, who was in South Jersey, and I dedicated my book Spandau Mystery to him. He's passed away. He was the first Moor to contact me and say, "Oh, wow, I can't believe you wrote this book. This is right on." And he introduced me to Sid Catlett Bay, who passed away recently. And Sid taught me so much. His father was the famous drummer, Sid Catlett Sr. Sid was a basketball player in the National Basketball Hall of Fame. He was the leading member of the only high school team to beat Kareem in basketball in high school. And he was a great guy, and he taught me so much. And he's the one who brought me to Chicago and Washington. But so anyway, so I met these Moors, and the Moors became a real part of my life. They used to come to my house. I used to have monthly meetings at my house, the Montauk night, and the best nights for me is when the Moors would come, sometimes with their fezzes, and they would be a part of the activity. And those were the greatest times I had. And it was also the Moorish Science, a girl from the Moorish Science Temple who grew up in it, sort of was the first one to tell me about the Qigong classes that I ended up going to. So the Moorish Science Temple was a gateway for me to meet my Qigong teacher, who was black, and he was the most knowledgeable person in Qigong you're ever going to want to meet. I studied with him for 10 years before he passed away. So Roosevelt Gainey, his name was. But the Moors have been an incredible experience for me. But I wrote that book, Seventh Seal, and then my next book was to write the Montauk Book of the Dead. And in the latter part of it, I include all this stuff about Noble Drew Ali. And what the hell does this have to do with what I just talked about? Yeah. If somebody is not sort of tuned into my earlier books and just reads the Scientology part, they're going to hit what the hell is this? Why is he talking about this? Yeah. However, it's tied to it, and this is why I'm very almost, I guess the word is flattered in a way that the Nation of Islam would be making the Scientology connection, because look at whatever's not right with the Nation of Islam. It's a human endeavor. Mm-hmm. They, by default or otherwise, could be the one thing that could redeem Scientology as a useful thing, because it can be very useful. It's taught in a very knuckleheaded and abusive way. I know that because I was expert in doing it, and it's been given a very bad name. But also, yeah. So it's like I if there's any hope for that to reach a broad amount of people, it would be through the Moorish connection, whether it's called NOI or anything else. So
yeah,
it's interesting.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I don't think Tom Cruise is really doing a good job as far as giving Scientology a good name. But I hear what you're saying, and just from
and when we talk about abuse, Scientology is a legacy of abuse. Now, it's certainly, this is my interaction. And because almost over 90% of my fellow Qigong students were black, and any of my interactions with the black community is that people they have a much more open energy field, but they also have a bigger bullshit detector. Mm-hmm. They have a bigger bullshit detector. So this is what I found. And, so in other words, Scientology as an organization has gotten away with a lot of, I don't know if they've I guess they have gotten away with it. There's just so much. But what is encouraging to me here is that because of where my research has taken me to Romania and to other adventures and other avenues, my Moorish connections have kind of lost touch. The Scientology connection to that whole element is sort of wow, it roots me back to that. And maybe we can look into this together and sort of see where all the dominoes line up, because I never forget where I came from. I don't forget my old neighborhoods, which means I can't forget the Scientology neighborhood I lived in for 11, 12 years, and I can't forget the Moorish neighborhood that I lived in and grew up. So it's it's always good to come back home and to see where this can take us.
Definitely. And I mean, maybe that's why we're all here, in this melting pot. I mean, like even just with the Dianetics and the thing with I think you referred to it as a charge, where you're finding the energy, the entry points.
Your voice is getting muffled.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me better now?
Not much, a little, but not much.
All right, hang on a second. Okay. All right, can you hear me now?
I can hear you, but it sounds like you're speaking through a tin can.
Oh man, not sure what's going on here. Hang on one second. Sorry about that. Okay. Are we any better now? Still the same?
It's not.
Still muffled?
No, it's not. No, we've developed a bad connection.
Okay, yeah. I'm sorry about that. There must be something going on with my internet connection, cause
maybe it means that we're hitting a hot topic, and I think we're about ready to wrap up anyway now. So
yeah.
Maybe that's just a sign, but we've hit a hot topic, and it gives us a sort of a direction to pursue for the future, which is good.
Definitely. That's great. And I just want to thank you for coming on. I appreciate you. Thanks for writing your books. Thank you for sharing this information, which is pretty much obscure. I mean, this is a great thing. I'm glad you came on with us, and hopefully we can do this again in the future.
Let me give my websites.
Okay.
For getting books, it's skybooks.usa.com, skybooks.usa.com, and also visit the timetraveleducationcenter.com, timetraveleducationcenter.com.
Great. So hopefully we can do this again in the future, and I just want to thank you for coming on.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks.
You take care.
Okay, you too. All right, bye.
Bye-bye.